There is no screaming in space. No one hears you call. There is nowhere to run, just a metal vessel drifting silently in the cold void millions of kilometers away from Earth. They say space is the final frontier, but no one told you it could also be the place where you lose your mind, a place with no day or night, a place where every little sound could be the last thing you ever hear. Tonight, we're not talking about planets, not about the stars, but about a failed mission, a spacecraft that never returned, and what really happened out there. No communications, no distress signals. All that's left is a recording and a few final log entries. So, what happened to those ships? Buckle up, turn off the lights, and join me in listening to the final log from that spacecraft. Humanity's journey into space is a long tale filled with countless incidents, so many that scientists would never have enough time to recount them all. But we, the ones passionate about science, we do have time to begin telling them. So, to continue our story from outer space, let us turn to one of the darkest corners of space exploration, a shadow not only cast over the scientists, but also over governments, the ones who stood up and decided that pioneering was more important than human lives. Since the first time we looked up at the sky and wished to conquer it, scientists and researchers have joined forces to take on every challenge in order to send humans above the clouds. But in this journey, there has never been a moment of true safety. First, to send a human into space, they must overcome Earth's gravity. That means sitting on top of a giant bomb, igniting it, and releasing an equally enormous amount of energy to generate enough thrust to escape the gravity well of the blue planet. Calling the rockets that send humans into space giant bombs isn't exactly accurate, because they represent the efforts of not only scientists, but also engineers and leading industry experts. They never intended to create an enormous, expensive device just to have it explode during launch. The same goes for governments. Rockets are incredibly costly machines, and no one wants to burn a mountain of money just for fun. The rocket failures are extremely rare events, ones that only happen due to errors that lie completely outside the predictive, analytical, and control capabilities of everyone involved in the project. However, rare does not mean non-existent. Before talking about such rare events, we need to understand the structure of a rocket and the component called an orbiter. Rockets used to send humans into space are always massive in size. The smallest rocket ever made is Japan's SS-520, standing 10 meters tall and capable of pushing a 4-kilogram payload into Earth's orbit. On the other end of the scale is SpaceX's Starship, the largest rocket ever built, towering at 120 meters. Despite their massive size, most of a rocket is just fuel. The actual capsule that carries the astronaut is incredibly small, comparable to a car mounted onto a massive fuel tank. This disproportionate ratio is one of the greatest challenges for scientists and aerospace engineers, because they have to find a way to balance it. To reach space, we need a lot of fuel, but carrying more fuel makes the rocket heavier. A heavier rocket then needs even more fuel, and adding more fuel only makes it heavier still. Because of this endless loop, the science of rocketry was born to ensure we can send rockets into space safely. Since the thrust a rocket produces is tied directly to the amount of fuel it carries, engineers came up with the idea of multi-stage launches, with each stage serving a different purpose in getting humans off Earth. The first stage burns the most fuel, with the goal of lifting the entire rocket system off the ground and into the sky. Once its job is done, the fuel tank of the first stage detaches automatically and falls into the ocean. At this point, the second stage ignites to accelerate the now lighter rocket. Since the first stage and its fuel are gone, the rocket is significantly lighter. Now, only moderate thrust is required to escape Earth's gravitational pull. Therefore, the second stage only needs a reasonable amount of fuel to complete its task. Once that ends, the rocket has reached the vacuum of space. From there, the trajectory can be fine-tuned, and the third stage propels the system toward its destination. This ingenious design allows the spacecraft to get lighter the farther it travels, increasing its durability. However, this system still has to overcome certain challenges, including the need to control the extreme heat generated by the burning of fuel. The first rocket to take humans to the Moon, Saturn V, used this three-stage design. And although the mission was a great success that gave the US a major lead over the Soviet Union, it was also an incredibly expensive endeavor. So investors and engineers began working toward a more cost-effective path to send humans into space. This is where the orbiter, or space shuttle, comes in. The Space Shuttle program was commissioned and funded by NASA in the late 1960s, and by 1981 the first shuttle, Space Shuttle Columbia, also known as STS-1, was launched into space. The advantage of the orbiter over traditional rockets lies in its operational model. Instead of building a whole new rocket from scratch for each mission, the orbiter could be reused multiple times. This allowed scientists and engineers to use it for building space stations and deploying satellites more efficiently. To achieve this, the orbiter was built as a separate entity from the main rocket. The launch system still had three components: two side boosters that provided most of the thrust needed to lift the shuttle into the sky, and a large central tank that held fuel for the orbiter. Once the fuel was spent, the boosters and tank would fall into the sea, allowing the orbiter to continue flying on its own. Thanks to this method, the orbiter could propel itself into space and return safely to Earth, ready for another mission. The two side boosters could also be recovered and reused for future launches. Basically, this has been the most efficient mode of transportation humanity has ever developed and used to this day. And humankind has built 6 space shuttles, including Challenger, Enterprise, Columbia, Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour. All 6 of these shuttles were maximally utilized throughout the 20th century and carried out countless space missions for the world. In 1986, the S-51L mission marked the 25th launch of a space shuttle into orbit. This journey wasn't particularly special, if we disregard the presence of one individual named Crystal McAuliffe. Crystal wasn't a professional astronaut. In fact, she was just a teacher. But she had registered and been selected to participate in the Reagan administration's Teacher in Space program. Somehow, President Ronald Reagan believed that sending a teacher into space was essential to American society, so he established this initiative, and Crystal was one of the lucky few chosen to go into space. However, in this case, lucky would not be the right word. The Challenger's launch was initially scheduled for July 1985, but it was then delayed to November, and once again to January 1986. January would be the final time the launch was rescheduled. On January 28, 1986, the entire United States turned on their televisions to watch the Challenger launch live. Engineers performed checks, reported to their superiors, who then approved the countdown sequence. The crew was suited up and boarded the shuttle one by one. After completing the inspection and preparation phases, engineers and crew members made contact and initiated the countdown to launch. And just like that, after the countdown ended, Challenger fired up its engines, blasting massive amounts of gas downward and descending into the sky, like many launches before. However, this time, something went wrong with one of the engines. Many eyes saw a trail of flame where it shouldn't have been. And before anyone could even ask a question, Challenger exploded and the entire crew fell from an altitude of 14,000 meters. The entire event, from liftoff to explosion, lasted a mere 73 seconds. No matter how well we balance fuel and thrust, we still need to use organic fuel to launch rockets. And as its name suggests, organic fuel is combustible. It can explode. Therefore, until we find a way to generate thrust without using organic fuel, every rocket remains a bomb we can never be certain won't explode. Given the massive amount of fuel in rockets, these bombs have a destructive force second only to weapons of mass destruction. If anyone had survived that explosion, it would have truly been a miracle. However, even if a miracle did occur, they would soon pass away regardless. Many newspapers reported the existence of audio recordings of the astronauts screaming in panic for approximately 2 minutes and 45 seconds after the explosion before the crew cabin impacted the ocean surface. Whether or not they survived the explosion, the violent crash into the sea surely ended it all. So what happened? Isn't NASA known for enforcing the highest safety standards? How could such a catastrophic failure occur? Initially, the flight was scheduled for July, a mid-year period with ideal weather conditions for such launches. However, after being postponed by nearly a year, things began to get complicated. The rescheduled launch happened in the middle of winter, and this posed a much bigger problem than anyone had anticipated. One crucial component in the rocket engine design was a sealing ring, known as the O-ring, which prevented fuel from leaking after the combustion chamber was activated. The O-ring's mechanism was designed so that when the combustion chamber ignites, the extreme heat and pressure would expand the ring, sealing any gaps between the joints of the fuel compartments. Basically, it functioned like the rubber stopper in a kitchen sink. When pressed down, it blocks the water because it seals the openings. However, that's how the O-ring works on a normal day. On that tragic day, things didn't go as they should have. Due to the freezing weather and prolonged exposure to cold, while the launch was repeatedly postponed, the O-ring had frozen and didn't function properly. So when the shuttle ignited and took off, the ring didn't expand, allowing fuel to leak out and flames to burst from one of the engines, triggering the explosion of the booster compartment. At this point, one might think the story ends here, that it was simply a tragic accident. But the truth is always more terrifying. There's no way NASA's engineers would have allowed the launch to proceed without thorough checks and preparations. The faulty O-ring in this engine had already been identified as a concern by both NASA and Morton Thiokol, the company that manufactured the engine. However, both parties dismissed the concern and allowed it to pass. That wasn't the only red flag that was ignored. There had been previous warnings, and yet the decision-makers still chose to proceed. During earlier shuttle missions, engineers had already identified flaws in the O-ring's design. They noted that the heat and pressure from fuel combustion could counteract the ring's function and cause it to fail. This meant the engine's design needed a complete overhaul, an effort that would require reinvestment and funding to build new shuttles. Nevertheless, this proposal was rejected by decision-makers, and missions continued as planned. But why? Why proceed knowing the risks? The issue lies in the political priorities during Ronald Reagan's administration. Continuously launching shuttles into space was a top military objective. Reagan wanted to demonstrate to the world that the US dominated the skies, and consistently sending missions into orbit was crucial to that image. This is also why Reagan created the program to send teachers into space, because for him, inspiring the next generation with the dream of sky domination was a non-negotiable policy. Overuse of the Challenger shuttle, combined with insufficiently thorough inspection, significantly increased the likelihood of an O-ring failure. However, this was not the end of the story. In reality, the Challenger's scheduled launch was not on the 28th, but on the 22nd. The launch was postponed to the 23rd because the previous flight, Mission 24, CS-61C, was delayed. Yet, for reasons unknown, Mission 24 was further rescheduled to the 25th, causing Challenger to wait another day and eventually launch on the 26th. But due to weather forecasts predicting poor conditions with rain and wind on the 26th, the launch was postponed again. The official launch date was then set for January 27th. The crew was ready to board, but during the final hatch inspection a problem was discovered with a screw that could not be unscrewed. Specialists had to bring personnel and drilling machines to address the issue. However, since battery-powered drills were unusable, the launch was delayed once more, finally taking place on the last day, January 28. According to our folk beliefs, the engineers and astronauts should have set up an altar and prayed for a smooth flight. But in a country where holy water sprinkling is the only method to ward off evil, the story unfolded differently. The story began with the 113th flight of the Space Shuttle program. mission STS-107 was the 28th flight of the shuttle Columbia, and it successfully launched on January 16, 2003. The 7-member crew, led by Commander Rick Husband, boarded Columbia to embark on a 16-day mission, involving 80 different space studies related to the development of the ISS, microgravity, and numerous physics experiments. The enormous workload forced the crew to work around the clock, with tasks carefully assigned to maintain each astronaut's health. Essentially, their work was similar to previous missions, conducting research only possible in space and bringing back results to advance space science, while also contributing to ISS development. The entire launch process of STS-107 went smoothly and followed plan, despite having been delayed 18 times between January 2001 and January 2003. These delays caused no major obstacles for Columbia's journey in space. Therefore, even though it was one of the earliest shuttles built, Columbia was a very sturdy vessel, having been used many times across various programs and continuously maintained to ensure optimal performance. Especially after the Challenger disaster, all shuttles were rigorously serviced. So why did this mission end in tragedy? The problem did not lie in the launch, but in the landing. Since the shuttle was propelled into orbit by rockets, it traveled at a speed of 27,358 km/h. Because space is a vacuum without air to slow it down, the shuttle maintained this speed while orbiting Earth. To land safely, it had to slow down before hitting the ground. This required a special maneuver known as pitching up. This meant angling the nose of the shuttle upward by 40 degrees, so the heat-resistant underside faced the atmosphere directly. This position created friction that slowed the shuttle as it re-entered Earth's atmosphere, allowing it to reduce speed enough to land safely. However, atmospheric friction is no trivial matter. People often underestimate air's power, but strong winds can uproot trees and tear off roofs. At the incredible re-entry speed, the shuttle generated enormous pressure and heat from friction, reaching temperatures as high as 1,650 degc, hot enough to turn the surrounding air into plasma. To protect the crew from this extreme heat, engineers coated the shuttle's underside with a special heat-resistant ceramic tile. These tiles performed excellently, consistently enabling astronauts to return safely. Yet when Columbia returned to Earth on February 1, 2003, all observers could see were faint glowing fragments falling toward the ocean. The re-entry should have produced 2 sonic booms, heard about 2 minutes after the shuttle hit the atmosphere. But no one saw or heard anything. The only remnants were glowing grey pieces descending from the sky. Columbia was consumed by fire upon re-entry, marking the next tragedy in the Space Shuttle program. What exactly happened? After collecting debris scattered from the shuttle, investigators reconstructed the final moments. Inside the cockpit, astronaut William M. was the only one aware that something had gone terribly wrong, meaning the rest of the crew were unaware that death was already upon them. At that time, except for M, the astronauts were unprepared for the impact. Some were not wearing gloves, others had their helmet visors open, and some had not fastened their seatbelts. Here is the English translation of your passage, keeping the content, wording, and meaning intact, while ensuring correct grammar and clarity in a single long paragraph. Why did the researchers know this? When investigating the crash site, they discovered that pilot William M. had pressed many different buttons on the control panel. These buttons had no effect on controlling the shuttle, and this was clear evidence that the shuttle had lost control. M desperately tried every way to survive in a panic, but failed. He pressed the alarm button, pressed the reset button, but nothing worked. Meanwhile, the crew had no time to prepare. The reason was that just as the alarm sounded, the shuttle's cabin pressure dropped to 0, instantly causing everyone to suffocate and lose consciousness within seconds. However, this was not the only reason the entire crew perished. Somehow the immense heat from the landing crash had leaked into the cockpit and melted all the equipment there. And of course, with temperatures high enough to melt metal, no one could survive. But even if someone had survived that fiery inferno, they would still have to face the destructive forces from the impact pressure inside the cockpit during atmospheric re-entry. The collision flipped the shuttle, throwing the cockpit out violently. To put it simply, in a moment the shuttle spun at a supersonic speed like a spinning top. The astronauts inside the cockpit were like being trapped inside a deadly blender. And that was the fate of the 7 astronauts on Columbia's final mission. They could not save themselves, no matter how hard they tried. But what caused this chain of disasters? The truth is, when we know the facts, everything is not only terrible, but also deeply depressing. The shuttle's design is so iconic that without even thinking, we know what it looks like: a massive fuel tank in the middle with 2 rocket boosters attached, connected to a spaceship shaped like an aeroplane. However, what few know is the function of small details on each part. A prime example is why the central fuel tank is painted a pale orange-yellow. This might seem like a trivial question, but it is actually very important. Unlike the 2 solid rocket boosters, the central fuel tank uses liquid fuel to feed the shuttle, creating the thrust to lift the whole craft. To keep liquid gases like hydrogen and oxygen in liquid form, the tank must be cooled to extremely low temperatures and insulated from the outside environment. The first reason for insulation is to keep the liquid fuel from evaporating, and the second, even more important, is to prevent the fuel from freezing due to the extreme cold. The yellow-orange outer layer we often see on the shuttle is actually foam or spray-on insulation that covers the fuel tank. Essentially, this was the best method the engineers at the time could come up with to ensure the shuttle's operation. But no matter what, foam is still foam, insulation is still insulation, and it's a material you can easily break off from refrigerators or TV packaging. So what does this have to do with the Columbia disaster? As mentioned, the truth is even more depressing, because those foam pieces were the direct cause of the entire Columbia accident. Contrary to popular belief, the failure did not happen during re-entry, but during launch. But why? Wasn't this mission a success? The crew flew to space, worked there for more than 2 weeks, and returned safely without any issues. So why then? Actually, that was the problem. The failure occurred at launch, but all information was concealed, and no one was told until it was too late. At about 82 seconds after liftoff, a piece of foam from the fuel tank broke off and struck the left wing of the shuttle. Although the foam was very light, traveling at tens of thousands of kilometers per hour, even a grain of sand is a deadly bullet. The dangerous part was that neither the crew nor the ground control knew about this foam strike. Only when suspicious data was decoded from telemetry did the situation start to change. NASA immediately realized the shuttle had a breach and needed to find a way to fix it before it was too late. But the shuttle was already in space, moving at breakneck speeds. There was no way to inspect the damage or repair it. NASA engineers contacted the U.S. Department of Defense to use national spy satellites to get a view of the damaged shuttle. However, this hope was almost impossible because the Department of Defense neither trusted nor had any reason to trust NASA's engineers on this matter. Imagine you're guarding one of the world's most valuable assets with the highest national security level, and now someone comes asking, "Can I borrow it to look at a small black spot from far away? Would you lend it?" Because of this, all attempts to locate the damage failed. NASA's engineers had to return empty-handed, while daily communication with the astronauts continued without any disclosure of the danger to their lives. Morale on board was critically important. The astronauts were in an environment completely unlike our own. No gravity, no wind, no atmospheric filtered light, and certainly no comfortable daily routines. Any single movement in space could lead to disaster. NASA engineers knew this well, and orders from leadership had sealed their mouths. No one was allowed to say anything about the shuttle's breach. And from there we understand how far the story has gone. On the left wing of the Columbia shuttle, there was a large damage caused by the collision with a piece of foam. This hole changed the pressure inside the shuttle and was the main cause of the disaster that befell the entire spacecraft. Without sufficient pressure, the entire crew suffocated during re-entry. Not only that, The intense heat generated from atmospheric friction burned the circuit boards in the left wing, disabling the necessary functions for a safe landing, resulting in the MUU being unable to process anything beyond that point. We need to ask the question, has foam debris ever fallen from a spacecraft before? And if so, why did this information seem to pass unnoticed by NASA authorities? Honestly, the answer is yes, and this is yet another absurd story. The first time foam debris fell was during mission STS-7, but it caused no damage, so it was considered negligible. The next time foam fell was during mission STS-32, and NASA engineers realized the problem was due to pressure differences between the fuel tank surface and the foam piece. From there, an upgrade was implemented, adding pressure relief pipes to prevent liquid gas from escaping. However, the problem persisted. After mission STS-3, engineers admitted this was a risk that had to be accepted because foam falling from the fuel tank was unavoidable. Later missions, STS-52 and STS-62, also saw foam debris fall, but since it was deemed an unavoidable nuisance and the damage was minor, no one paid much attention. When the Columbia disaster occurred, no one could accept this risk anymore. So, was there any change after that? Before answering, we need to ask, why was the Space Shuttle program created? First, we must clarify that the Space Shuttle program was never NASA's original plan. After the Apollo program successfully landed humans on the Moon, NASA immediately focused on developing a medium-range transportation project rather than launching costly rockets into space. This was the STS program, short for Space Transport System. This system included orbiting spacecraft permanently in the sky powered by nuclear energy and Earth's gravity. It was intended to facilitate future space research missions, including moon landings and eventually missions to Mars. However, with the United States having landed on the Moon, the US government positioned itself as the pioneer. Therefore, space exploration efforts were cut back and redirected towards military objectives instead of scientific purposes. Essentially, NASA's budget was reduced from 4% of the Department of Defense's GDP to under 1%. Due to this, NASA's STS plan was shelved, and a more rudimentary plan called the Space Shuttle program was selected for on an unspecified date in 1972. President Nixon signed the order authorizing the Space Shuttle program's construction. Besides budget issues, the shuttle served another critical purpose for the US military objectives. The shuttle could carry cargo into space and deploy special satellites to enhance US reconnaissance capabilities and dominance over the skies during the 1980s. That is why the construction of the ISS and satellite launches were approved. From there, shuttles like Challenger, Columbia, Atlantis, and Discovery were built. However, the Space Shuttle program turned out to be a massive financial loss for the US government. First, the cost per shuttle launch, including maintenance and operational expenses, exceeded $500 million, 0 cents. In total, over the program's lifetime, it consumed $196 billion, 0 cents. Furthermore, operating the shuttles required workshops, personnel, and budgets for spare parts and repairs. The total cost for these supporting facilities reached $12 billion, 0 cents, not to mention other losses. The program also lost 2 shuttles, Challenger and Columbia, resulting in suspension and additional unexpected costs. Ultimately, the program's conclusion was foreseeable, and as expected, on January 14, 2004, President Bush's administration signed the order to end the Space Shuttle missions, confirming that the final flight would be Atlantis on an unspecified date in 2011. After Atlantis returned to Earth following 12 days in space, the US officially had no means to travel to space anymore. From then on, they had to rely on other countries, specifically Russia's Soyuz spacecraft, to go beyond Earth's atmosphere. This marked the end of the entire Space Shuttle program. The 20th century can be regarded as the era of the world's most explosive scientific progress. The time gap between the Wright brothers' first flight and Neil Armstrong's first step on the Moon was only about 60 years. And no matter how we celebrate those achievements, they are ultimately consequences of war. War is the period when leaders invest the most in science. They believe that only by pouring money into the mouths of engineers and geniuses can they defeat their enemies. Essentially, they were right. Alan Turing and the first computers, Robert Watson radio, and of course Oppenheimer with his bomb, all changed the course of the world. However, few speak of the price paid for such rapid technological advancement. What happened to the pioneers, the people who risked their lives so the world could gain those great scientific achievements? Does anyone truly know their fates? Or do we only remember their successes and forget their failures? War drives scientific progress, and the Cold War was no exception. Throughout the 1950s to the 1980s, the US and the Soviet Union continuously competed to dominate the skies. This gave rise to the so-called space race. After Oppenheimer planted the mushroom cloud over the land of the rising sun, both superpowers realized that whoever controlled the skies would control the world. From that moment, the race to conquer space began, driving both nations to continuously pour money into the mouths of the most brilliant engineers and scientists of that era. This led to the birth of the earliest scientific achievements. Humanity began taming the wild flames to transform them into tools that could lift them up to the heavens. In 1955, the Soviet Union responded to the United States' announcement about launching an artificial satellite by initiating its own satellite program. Just 2 years later, in October 1957, the USSR launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. Only a month later, the Soviet Union pulled far ahead of the United States by sending up Sputnik 2, accompanied by Laika the dog, marking the first living creature to fly into space. The count of the Soviet lead, just a few months later, on January 31, 1958, the US launched the Explorer satellite. Afterwards, the US upgraded NACA into NASA and launched the next satellite named SCORE, which transmitted President Eisenhower's Christmas message to the American people, essentially a propaganda move to outshine the Soviets. However, the Soviet Union was not willing to lose and kept proving itself the pioneer by sending Luna 1 in 1959, a rocket so powerful it escaped not only Earth's orbit, but also past the Moon, now orbiting the Sun. The brutal race between the USSR and the US continued relentlessly, causing countless documents to be soaked with ink and countless pens to be worn down, while rockets kept being launched into the sky. Yet, the biggest goal for these countries was not just to send metal objects or satellites into space. Their ultimate goal was to send humans beyond the atmosphere, and in 1961, the Soviet Union proved it was the winner of the journey into space by sending Yuri Gagarin aboard Vostok 1, making him the first person to leave the blue planet. Not stopping there, the USSR sent Vostok 6 with the first woman in space, Valentina Tereshkova. Then, in 1965, Alexei Leonov left the Voskhod 2 spacecraft and took a 12-minute spacewalk. Essentially, the USSR dominated space and became the pioneers of this grand endeavor. However, not every success lasts forever. Not every pioneer enjoys the fruits of their labor. After the success of Voskhod 2, the Soviet Union launched another project aimed at creating space transportation that could send humans into space and safely bring them back, called Soyuz. By 1967, Soyuz 1 was prepared for launch, and from that point, disaster began. Born in 1927, Vladimir Komarov was a test pilot and a renowned aerospace engineer in the Soviet Air Force. More than that, he was the direct commander of Voskhod 1, which had successfully sent many cosmonauts into space and back safely. This meant he not only had spaceflight experience, but also had proven efficiency in doing so. For this reason, Vladimir Komarov was chosen as the pilot for Soyuz 1's maiden flight. However, by August 1967, Soyuz 1 was still not ready, contrary to the world's expectations of the Soviet Union and their space program. NASA, the United States, was actually the more promising and powerful force. Though the USSR had more achievements and was always the front-runner, everything seemed like a stroke of luck for the Red Army. Comparing a Soviet space project to an American one, it was clear that the Americans were more diligent in going to space. Moreover, the Soviets' toys were bulkier, and everything seemed to rest on one person's shoulders, Sergei Korolev. After World War II, Sergei joined the Winter Warriors and came to the Soviet Air Force, building ballistic missile programs for them. If Einstein was the great genius of the universe, Sergei was a genius in managing talent. He was not only skillful in dealing with superiors, but also meticulous in rocket design and directly involved in creating plans to send humans into space. In short, Lenin did not send Yuri Gagarin into space, nor did he send Alexei Leonov out into the vacuum. Sergei was the one who made it happen. With these colossal achievements, one can easily see the problems the USSR faced when they put all their eggs in one basket. Then, the inevitable happened. Sergei Korolev suddenly passed away in January 1966 at the age of 59. His death caused a major crisis in the Soviet space program because he was the only person with both the brilliant mind to solve space problems and the political skill to navigate the bureaucracy. After Sergei's death, the Soviet government immediately appointed his colleague, Vasily Mishin, as his successor to continue the unfinished projects of the late genius. However, Vasily was not Sergei, and what Sergei left behind was too monumental for one man to handle alone. These projects were not only the overly ambitious wishes of the Soviet government, such as sending humans to the moon to rival the US, but also a chaotic mess without Sergei's procedural rigor. In an interview with Scientific American, engineer Sergei Khrushchev recounted his father Nikita Khrushchev's experience working with Korolev, saying, "Everything seemed unstructured, and Sergei Korolev would push multiple tasks simultaneously until results emerged." This led to the consequence that when someone succeeded Korolev, they would be completely at a loss, because there was no process, meaning there was no continuity. For this reason, the Soyuz 1 program was launched under government pressure to push forward the progress to rival NASA, even though it was not ready at all, partly because the program was still in the process of fixing technical errors, and partly because the budget allocated for the program had been cut due to Vasily's lack of political skill compared to Sergei. In the end, the hero Vladimir Komarov was sent on an ill-prepared, underfunded, deadline-driven flight with no guarantees. The Soyuz test flights were never truly successful. The first mission launched the spacecraft into orbit, but failed to deploy a solar panel over Soviet territory, forcing the government to order self-destruction. The next test flight not only failed to reach space, but also damaged the launch pad. The third test, via the Cosmos 140 program, did reach space but lost control upon landing and caused damage to the spacecraft. While these problems remained unresolved, the government decided to proceed with the launches of Soyuz 1 and Soyuz 2 as scheduled, so what was about to happen was likely anticipated by everyone involved in the Soyuz program. At 3:00 p.m. on April 23, 1967, Vladimir Komarov was at the Soyuz 1 launch pad. The Soyuz rocket ignited and began lifting Komarov into space. Everything seemed to be going according to plan as the three stages of the engine separated and Komarov entered orbit. However, everyone knew this was not a peaceful trip. Immediately upon reaching space, the spacecraft encountered a problem when one of its solar panels failed to deploy. Although the ship had backup batteries, to complete the mission's expected duration, it needed sufficient power from the nearest star. Because one panel did not open, the Soyuz mission had to be shortened. The power issue was not the only problem Komarov faced. Communications with ground control were unstable. Alone in space, with a partially powered spacecraft, Komarov remained calm and tried to manage the situation while waiting for contact with Earth to be restored. Aware of Komarov's situation, Soyuz 2, which had been prepared for military research, was reassigned to rescue him. However, bad weather prevented its launch. Intermittent communication as Soyuz 1 approached Soviet territory, gave Komarov hope of rescue, only to have it dashed repeatedly. All involved, including Komarov himself, made a daring decision: to manually pilot the spacecraft back to Earth, a feat never before attempted. This also marked the last time Komarov communicated with ground control. From the heights of space, the spacecraft plummeted to Earth at a speed exceeding 140 km/h, much faster than it should have been. One of the two parachutes malfunctioned and failed to deploy at the right moment, causing both parachutes to become entangled during descent. As a result, Komarov and Soyuz 1 crashed violently to the ground. Then the fuel ignited and the ship burst into flames. Vladimir Komarov, a gifted Soviet pilot, a patriotic cosmonaut loyal to his homeland, was reduced to ashes. Komarov's death earned him the title of twice Hero of the Soviet Union, a state funeral, and a memorial at Red Square. Latrable. But what was it all for? The man was gone. What remained? Yet, the tragedy did not end there. In the story, one key person has not been mentioned: a different Soviet hero, another pioneer who was supposed to take Komarov's place, Yuri Gagarin. The relationship between Yuri Gagarin and Vladimir Komarov can be summed up in two words: inseparable. Both were patriots, military men, and became national heroes. Their friendship extended beyond comradeship. They were real-life friends, hunting together and sharing drinks during free time. However, everything changed when both were selected for the Soyuz program. Both knew the program had problems and that the spacecraft was unsafe. They tried to prevent the launch. Yuri Gagarin had a friend working at the KGB, so he wrote a 10-page report detailing 203 technical faults in the program to delay progress. However, this effort failed because the report was seen as treason, and anyone who saw it was sent to Siberia, including Benjamin Rusev, Yuri's close friend working at the KGB. Knowing their fates, Komarov insisted on participating in the Soyuz program, a decision no one else dared make. But why did Komarov choose this, even though his chances of survival were extremely slim? He told Rusev that if he didn't go, the government would send someone else, and that someone was Yuri Gagarin. Komarov wanted to protect Yuri at all costs, even at the cost of his own life. That is why he decided to go on the flight. This story was directly recounted by Benjamin Rusev in Jamie Doran and Piers Bisonet's book Starman, which reveals the truth behind the glory of Soviet space heroes. However, this is not the only version of the truth. On the day Soyuz was launched, reporter Yaroslav Golovanov saw Yuri Gagarin at the launch pad, offering to wear the cosmonaut. The Soyuz 1 accident not only took away one hero from Earth. For Gagarin, it also took away a close friend, one who sacrificed himself to save him. This event changed Yuri's life, causing him to lose himself and drown in alcohol. The Soviet Air Force dismissed him due to his treasonous efforts earlier. So Yuri no longer flew or served his country. Once a global hero, he became a lost shadow of a man who, however, by 1968, Yuri seemed to want to rebuild his life. He gave up alcohol and fought to regain his rank, and with the determination of the first man in space, he succeeded. In March 1968, he returned to the skies in a MiG-15 UTI. And although this could be seen as a return to glory for a famous hero, this is not that story. The plane carrying him crashed near the town of Kerjach, and Yuri Gagarin met the same fate as his close friend, being cremated alongside the experimental aircraft. The investigation into the incident yielded only vague results, stating that bad weather had affected his flight, ultimately leading to the unfortunate accident. Many rumors and conspiracy theories emerged following Yuri Gagarin's death. However, no matter what, he had passed away, marking the end of two Soviet space heroes. The story begins in 1970, a time when the United States had already sent Neil Armstrong to the moon, marking his small step in humanity's great journey. Of course, this was not in the Soviet Union's plan, as they had always been the pioneers. So, with the US taking the lead, the Soviet Union had to find another way to maintain its reputation in the world, proving they were still at the forefront. Instead of sending people to the moon, the Soviets focused on building a space station to enable frequent human presence in space. From there, they could remain the rulers of the skies. To achieve this, the Soviet Union modified the military Almaz space station program and transformed it into the Soyuz program. Soyuz was quickly put into production and was scheduled to launch on April 12, 1971, coinciding with the 10th anniversary of Yuri Gagarin's flight on Vostok 1. However, technical issues delayed the launch to September 19. Then, on September 14, Soyuz 1 was launched into space, becoming humanity's first space station. Thus, the Soviet Union once again became pioneers. Instead of sending people to the moon, they were the first to build a home in space. However, a home needs occupants, so the plan to send people to the station was set in motion. Just 4 days after Soyuz 1 was launched, the mission to send crew to the station was initiated with a spacecraft named Soyuz 10. To understand what happened with Soyuz 10, one must understand the structure and operation of Soyuz 1. The space station was a cylindrical block 20 meters long and 4 meters wide. It was designed with a special docking mechanism to maintain pressure inside and outside the station whenever a spacecraft visited. When a spacecraft like Soyuz approached, the two vessels would connect through this pressure hatch, allowing astronauts to move safely from the spacecraft into the Soyuz station. This may sound simple, but in reality it was anything but. Space is where Newton's laws are most apparent. Even the smallest gesture can cause you to drift into the vastness of space with no way back. Therefore, operating a giant spacecraft, approaching the right spot, docking accurately and connecting the hatch safely and automatically is extremely complex. This was why Soyuz 10 failed to dock successfully. After launch, the Soyuz 10 crew was expected to work aboard the station for 22 days before returning to Earth. However, the spacecraft could not dock with the station, despite 5 hours of efforts by the crew and ground control. For safety reasons, the mission was aborted and Soyuz 10 returned to Earth, landing safely in Kazakhstan. Because Soyuz 10 failed, the government immediately pushed forward the Soyuz 11 program to send cosmonauts to the station and establish a Soviet presence living off-planet. The initial crew included Alex Leonov, the first man to walk in space, Valery Kubasov, who had flown on Soyuz 6, and engineer Peter Kolodin. However, after medical checks and resource considerations, the crew was replaced with Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev. On June 7, 1971, the crew boarded the launch pad, and everyone witnessed Soyuz 11's successful launch. After reaching orbit, Soyuz approached Soyuz to within 6 to 7 kilometers before starting to slow down. After 24 minutes, the distance between Soyuz and Soyuz was reduced to 9 meters, and the spacecraft switched from automatic to manual control like Soyuz 10. Docking took considerable time and effort, but after about 3 hours the crew completed the connection. After checking all locks, valves and equipment, the crew entered Soyuz 1, beginning a 22-day mission in space. Until June 29 of the same year, the mission was highly successful and gave the Soviet Union a significant advantage in the space race against the US. It was a major step in turning Americans into followers and establishing the Soviets as true masters of space. However, it was not yet time to celebrate, because the crew still had to return safely. On June 29, 1971, the crew left Soyuz 1 and returned to Soyuz 11. The undocking process happened by a narrow margin, and Soyuz 11 began firing its engines to lower its altitude and return to Earth. The procedure was automatic, and the spacecraft successfully landed in Kazakhstan only 25 minutes later. After locating the spacecraft, the escort team arrived to assist the astronauts in exiting the capsule. Because of the sudden change in environment, astronauts usually require support to move safely after landing. Medical personnel were already on site to prepare for them. However, upon opening the airlock and entering the spacecraft, they couldn't believe their eyes. All 3 astronauts were lying motionless. Their bodies showed no signs of injury, but blood was streaming from their noses and ears. Witnessing the horrifying scene, the medical team quickly administered artificial respiration and tried to save them. Since Dobrovolsky's body was still warm, there was some hope. However, all efforts were in vain. All 3 astronauts had died. Initial autopsy revealed the cause of death was asphyxiation. But why asphyxiation? After the spacecraft was recovered, an investigation was launched. It was clear the astronauts had suffocated, so the problem must lie with the air valve and cabin pressure. Further investigation at the scene showed Patsai was not in the same place as the other 2 astronauts. His body was found near the cabin's air valve, raising many questions about what happened in those final minutes. Additionally, cabin data indicated that only 15 minutes after leaving the Salyut station, the cabin pressure dropped to 0. Worse still, the cabin maintained that vacuum until it re-entered Earth's atmosphere. Upon autopsy, new information surfaced. The astronauts' bodies were bruised on the head, with hemorrhages in their eyes and ears. This condition occurred because the cabin pressure dropped suddenly, causing blood vessels in their bodies to burst, similar to how a vacuum cleaner sucks out air. When a cabin uses a vacuum environment, it pulls all air out of the astronauts' bodies, causing oxygen and nitrogen in their blood to bubble, leading to blood vessel rupture. Ultimately, the cause of death was the sudden decompression caused by a leaking air valve during the vacuum phase. The Soyuz 11 astronauts became the first victims of space vacuum and the only people to have died in space. But where was the air valve that leaked? Hadn't they been in space for 22 days unharmed? The fact is, the Soyuz spacecraft had a special landing mechanism. To land, the cabin had to separate from the fuel and solar panel modules. During this separation, one of the spacecraft's air valves was torn, eventually causing the decompression. Patsai's position near the valve showed he tried to seal it with his hand. However, the sudden decompression was so severe he must have lost consciousness before doing anything else. One might wonder, how could the astronauts suffocate while still inside the spacecraft? The sad truth is, at that time, the astronauts were not wearing spacesuits inside the cabin. Therefore, when the cabin lost pressure, it was like they were thrown into vacuum, facing death directly. This tragic event served as a wake-up call for officials to accelerate space safety protocols. Astronauts were thereafter required to wear spacesuits during nearly all activities to avoid such fatal incidents. Nevertheless, regardless of future changes, the lives of these 3 heroes were taken. Worse yet, the Soviet Union kept the incident secret, and the cause of death was only revealed 2 years later. Although they were posthumously awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union and given a state funeral, the pain for their families remained. Moreover, the secrecy delayed global space progress, because for 2 years, no one knew the cause was due to the air valve. Some engineers became stuck in spacecraft cabin designs, suspecting the Soyuz failure was caused by toxic gas from burning electronics inside a sealed cabin. In the end, going to space has never been safe, no matter how well prepared we are. Astronauts are the most reckless daredevils, willingly placing themselves where the breath of death touches their visor. What do you think about this content? Let us know in the comments below, and if you like similar content, don't forget to like, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any future videos. Thank you for listening all the way through, and see you in the next stories.